Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Clay Arts Centre. We're just going to give it a little bit of time and allow people to join us online here tonight. Do our panelists want to just do a quick shout out where they are located right now?
Sure. I'm Beth Lo, and I'm in Missoula, Montana, in my studio, which facing west, facing my window where it has the best light.
I'm Nikki Lau. I'm currently in Pennsylvania, and I'm in the kitchen where there's the best Wi-Fi connection.
Awesome. I'm Cathy Liu. I'm in Helena, Montana. I'm actually at the Archie Bray Center right now, and I'm in their education center, which has air conditioning and very good Wi-Fi.
And Jessica?
Hey everyone, I'm actually at the Clay Arts Center on site right now. Great Wi-Fi here. We're in Port Chester, New York, and looking forward, excited.
Okay, so I think we have all our attendees, so I think I'll kick things off. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Regina Farrell-Fagan and I'm the exhibitions manager at Clay Arts Centre. I'm so happy to present this panel tonight. It's going to be moderated by Jessica Zeng, who's our sales and program associate at Clay Arts Centre. So I am going to hand things over to Jessica Zeng, who's going to be our moderator tonight, and she's going to introduce our artists and will handle the questions and answers at the end of our session. Thank you, Jessica.
Great. Thank you, Regina. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I am the Programs and Sales Assistant of Clay Arts Centre, as Regina mentioned, and I'm like super thrilled to have Nikki, Beth, and Cathy with us tonight for our panel discussion. And I also want to thank the audience for taking time to come and listen to us, and hopefully the questions and answers tonight will resonate with a lot of people. So I'm, as I said, I'm the moderator, but again, it's going to be the show of these three fine artists. So excited, and I just want to say that, so I'm so happy 2020 is over. It was a very enlightening year, but also very sad, and the pandemic's far from over, by the way, but I just wanted to say that I've learned to be appreciative of these so far the quiet moments of like normality, whatever they are, and I'm happy to see people out and about. But I also want to acknowledge the fatigue of everything and how it's a lot to digest still, and I'm hoping like with today's discussion where we'll talk about like racism and history and art, I hope that will be a means for everyone to sort of take a breath, decompress, that sort of think about what's happened to everyone and to us personally in the last few years and months and in American history in general. So let me see, I am going to share my screen and I'm going to talk, I'm going to introduce the artist. So, give me a moment there. Okay. Alrighty, so this is Beth Lo is one of our panelists tonight. This is some of her work. This is a vase. So Beth's ceramic and mixed media artwork draws from themes of childhood, family, Asian culture, and language. She received a Bachelor of General Studies from the University of Michigan in 1971. And then she studied ceramics at the University of Montana, receiving her MFA in 1974. She's currently a professor of art at the University of Montana. This is a series of platters that she did called Learn Chinese. And then this is another one of her works called To Go. After Beth, we have Cathy Liu. Cathy's work manipulates traditional Chinese art objects and symbols as a way to deconstruct the assumptions we have about Asian American identity and cultural authenticity. She was recently in a group exhibition hosted by the American Museum of Ceramic Art called Making in Between Contemporary Chinese Americans, and currently has an outdoors installation called the Customs Declaration with the Berkeley Art Center. So this work that we see on the screen here is called Treasure Case, and it's filled with a whole different bunch of ceramic items. Let me see here. And then this is called Peach Garden. And this here, which is one of her more recent works, is called Barriers. Great. And then we have Nikki Lau. Nikki was recently part of Claret Center's Artisan Resident Program. She was a 2010 to 2011 alumni of AmeriCorps and Public Allies and received her MFA with a concentration in ceramics at Penn State in 2016. Her work is informed by social justice, identity politics, self-love, I would say, and playfulness. Nikki is currently based in Pennsylvania. So this year was an installation at Claret Center, and looks like neon, but it's actually clay. Very cool. And this is some more of her work. These are some fruit rattlers. And then this is a fruit holder. Okay, so we're going to get to the questions. That's not share. Okay, everyone sees the right things right now. Okay, great. So question time. So my first question to everyone is what implicit bias towards Asian Americans are problematic in the ceramic world?
You might have to call on somebody.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm going to repeat the question again. What implicit bias towards Asian Americans are problematic in the ceramics world? If that's a little too narrow, like if that's too like focused for you, you could talk about implicit bias in general to start off with, if you'd like. All right, around Beth.
Okay. Well, I thought I want thanks to Claret Center, and thanks to Jessica for putting together some really thought-provoking questions. And we three are, I mean, this is a discussion about Asian American or Asian ceramics or Asian American ceramics. And I just wanted to say, coincidentally, the four of us are all Chinese, right? So we don't represent the full Asian AAPI version of things, but we will talk from our own experiences with a little bit of extrapolation probably towards some of the other races of Asian people. But I do feel like there's a connection between Asians that is pretty powerful for me, even though I was born in the United States. But when I thought about specifically bias in the ceramics world towards Asian Americans, I was thinking, I don't think I've personally experienced it. I think in my life, I've been pretty lucky and have had mostly very positive reactions to my being an Asian American. I think since I was born and raised here, I act mostly American and certainly wanted to fit in as I was growing up, and also had issues about being Chinese in a mostly white school. But I think that, you know, with the history of Asian ceramics, there's all kinds of mixed feelings about Asian work and the traditions of ceramics. And so it does sort of maybe influence Asian American ceramics. I think it's a little bit off the subject, but I was thinking a little bit about how back when I started doing pottery, everybody wanted to be Japanese. You know, everybody wanted to make Mingei folk pottery. And so that had this sort of veer off into a certain kind of Asian aesthetics. And then as contemporary ceramics has sort of become more of a field, there's a lot more emphasis on individualism and content and even social action in your work. And so in a way that's given a little more, the Westerners and the Asian Americans maybe have had an advantage because a lot of us are working in a vein that fits sort of contemporary norms that are popular at this time. And I just think it's really good to keep an eye on the whole art history and how things change over time. And we're in a specific moment in time. So what about you guys? What have you experienced bias, pro or con?
Oh, go for it. Oh no, Nikki, go for it. Go for it.
Oh, well, I was thinking about this question and I was thinking about it like as far as intersectional identity, in the sense that like, I just remember like in one of the residencies I was at, I noticed that people doubted whatever knowledge that I had to share. And a lot of it had to do with like up until that point, I was the only, I think it had been 5 years since they had like a woman resident. And then I don't even know if they've ever had an Asian resident come through. So a lot of the times it's like you're coming in as like the first person they've ever met.
Wow. Was that in an urban setting or rural or?
It was
small?
urban, well,
Oh.
urban. But yeah, no, I'm used to being like either the first or it's been a while since they've had a person of color come through. So I think there's a general like, oh, what do we do with this? So yeah, I guess there's that. So yeah, when there is lack of representation, I see where like stereotypes start to fill in.
Yeah, Nikki, I think that was really great how you brought up like the aspect of intersectionality, because for sure that plays into it as well. I think for me too, like working at different institutions, people normally don't look at me as the professor. They're like, oh, are you a student? Or, you know, they're just automatically, I could see their eyes going to like the tallest man in the room. But I think like in terms of thinking about like my experience thinking about Asian American identity in ceramics, I think for myself, like my MFA is actually in sculpture. And I think it was because I always felt so kind of, I don't know, like, and I think this is maybe like my own reaction to like the love of Asian ceramics, like the love of Japanese ceramics and like kind of this like fetishization of Asia and like porcelain. And so for me, that kind of, I think, drove me to go in a different direction. Just because I also recognize like when I would hang out like in, you know, in Sika or different events, like people were just always so interested in my heritage because they would see my face and they would be like, oh, you know, they find out like, you know, oh, my family's from Taiwan. And even before they knew my name, they would be like, oh my God, Taiwan's so great. Like I built a kiln there, you know? And so for me, that was very, I think disheartening because I think like Asians get a lot of play, but I think the category of like Asian American, we're still like, no one really knows what that is. Like, I don't know what that is necessarily either. So yeah, that's kind of what the question brought up for me, just sort of thinking about like this category of Asian American and how people see that in relation to Asians. Because a lot of times, like in a lot of schools, like at least in my art program, there were a lot of Asians or East Asians rather, but they were all international students. But in terms of Asian Americans, it was actually just 2 people out of like a program. I want to say like 100 in total, like this grad program. So yeah, that's kind of what it brought up for me.
So it was hard for them to categorize you kind of, put you in a, how do I deal with this person? That's but not really.
I don't know if it was like for them, like, oh, how do I deal with this person? But I think for them, they sort of maybe already had assumptions about who I was that didn't actually reflect who I was. So I think that was like kind of the problem for me. It's like, oh, you think because of the way I look, basically, like you sort of have this idea of like who I am, what my family is like, or my experience. And in actuality, you actually have no idea. That's kind of how I felt about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely identify with the grad school experience about being Asian American and trying to define that. I mean, I've had professors ask me where I was really from. So.
Yes. It's really, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened. You graduated in 2016, right? Is that, wow, okay. That's a real bummer.
There was like a sub question about tokenism to this, and I kind of wanted to address it. There have been institutions that I've worked at where I remember I had my photograph taken, and in 1 month, that photograph was used 8 times to be advertised for that institution.
Wow.
And I think that says a lot about like why is there not more diversity or more inclusive? Why is it not a more inclusive space? Why does my image need to be repeated that many times? Probably because there aren't that many people of color there to begin with. And just like not having someone on staff to actually recognize that that's problematic.
I think I come from a different generation, and I didn't have that experience at all. It was pretty, when I got my job teaching at University of Montana. Oh, and by the way, I'm retired. I'm a retired person. I'm done. When I got my job there, it was, I think I was still under the stereotype of, oh, Asian Americans are hardworking, diligent, want to fit in, make nice. And there wasn't quite the need for tokenism yet. I think that there wasn't a sense of, oh my gosh, we've got to present ourselves as very multicultural. I think I just, I slid into that job, and I was lucky.
They were lucky. They were lucky to have you, Beth. Yeah, I think for me, I thought about the question from like, I guess not from like the institution using, I mean, yes, there's that I sense of like the institution using you, but I guess for me, I just sort of thought about how like a lot of times I feel like, and it's sort of like, I think internalized racism where you're like, oh, am I only here because I'm like the diversity person? Like, did they only choose me because like they need to say like, we don't have a program of all white people. And so I sort of like kind of thought about this like weird internalized self-doubt that racialized people have in the US. But I just try to just, I don't know if this is like the healthy way to approach it, but I try to just push it down, like ignore it. Like, just because like my approach is just like, you know what, I'm here, I'm gonna make the most out of it, I'm gonna get the most out of it, and I'm gonna use this like thing on my resume or the connections that I make to bring in or like promote my other, students of color to make sure that they also have opportunities. But I do think it's so messed up that like, I mean, I don't know how you two feel, but I know for me, like sometimes I do think like, oh, am I here because I feel this like diversity quotient? And I kind of think that's so unfortunate because, I don't know, there's a lot of mediocrity out there, like white mediocrity. And so like, I don't know why I should be thinking this, like have this self-doubt when like the white mediocrity is like totally fine. I don't know.
It kind of leads into one of Jessica's other questions, but how do you guys feel about creating what I forget how you put it, like artificial diversity or I mean, I think, okay, I'm gonna say I'm old again, but I mean, we used to call it equal opportunity. and it was largely aimed towards Blacks and women. Those were the sort of the two main groups. So is it a good idea to buck the percentages and bring people in who have maybe had less opportunity? And what do you guys think about that? You know what I'm saying, right?
Are you kind of talking about like affirmative action or something? Or?
Yeah, like affirmative action, or well, like you said, maybe you were brought in because you were a token color. So is that a good thing to have institutions, like I said, buck the percentages? So say 20% of people applying for a job are of a racial minority. So should we work harder to have 50% of our faculty be people of color, or is that too artificial? Oh gosh, you guys are so.
No, I mean, I think it's such a hard question because like I do think it should be considered, like people like from historically excluded groups should sort of have a leg up. I do believe that. But in terms of the percentages, it's kind of weird to me. Like, how do you decide like there should be 10% of one group, then 15%, but like, oh, now we have too many Asians, like let's have less Asians, you know? Like, I guess I'm thinking specifically of like, recently there was that, I don't know, this might go into a different direction, but like that Harvard case. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate because I almost feel like if the affirmative action wasn't there, then it might just go back to like having all white male, all cis white male or something, which is scary. But also the percentages is like, how do you decide like 25% this, 5% this? It's weird.
Yeah, I kind of made up the percentage question, but it's sort of like you would want to bump somebody up that maybe, you know, like you say, to because they haven't had a chance, or they maybe they come from a school that isn't as, you know, it isn't Alfred or something, you know. And I'm making that up too, but just like lifting people up, I think is the term. Do you lift people up?
Yeah, for me, I don't think of it as lifting, but more like contribution. Like I do think, like, again, thinking about diversity, like having different perspectives, you know, because yeah, I think that is like how boring to have all the same people from the same exact program, like taught from the same exact person, or because that is what, you know, the more perspectives we have, the better, right? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think it's charity, I guess. I think it's like, it's a contribution. Like schools are lucky to have faculty of color.
Yeah. Very good.
Yeah. Are we ready for the next question? Or Nikki, you wanna say something else?
Oh, I guess, yeah, I completely agree with Cathy. For me, it's like whenever I think about, like when I enter into like any space, whether it's ceramics or whatever I'm doing, I think about whose voice is not being heard right now, or whose voice is missing. And so maybe that is the question for me, is like, what are we missing by not having like everyone there?
Great, thank you. Loving the responses so far. Okay, so the next question is, when we try to dismantle discrimination, we're working in partnership with Black Lives Matter. How are Asians racialized differently in America? So this question is sort of thinking about where we fit in the big puzzle of America and race here in this country. Any thoughts? No, fighters, no. I could read a quote. I have a quote from Minor Feelings by Cathy Parkong, which might stir up maybe a fire. Okay, so this is from a book called Minor Feelings, and she writes, in the popular imagination, Asian Americans inhabit a vague purgatorial status, not white enough nor Black enough, distrusted by African Americans, ignored by whites, unless we're being used by whites to keep the Black man down. So her particular quote was referring to after World War II, after the US had like an immigration ban specifically towards Asian Americans, which was the first of its kind in, you know, history, in American history. And they had to let go of that ban. They had to cancel that law because to show that they were, just to show that just to show that they're a good, America's a good country, because they were like this was like partly to combat, like, you know, socialism and communism from that time period. And they were sort of using the Asian race to sort of set an example, like, oh, they're model minority, they're better behaved compared to like Blacks in America. So that's what she means by using Asians to like hold the Black man down from back then. So y'all have thoughts? Anyone? Any biters?
I have so many thoughts, but I feel like I've talked a lot. So
No,
Nikki,
go.
please go. No, please.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay, so I was just gonna say, yeah, you know, like thinking about like this idea of the model minority myth and like how white supremacy works is like, you know, even historically, even back to the days when like African Americans were enslaved, like, you know, we were like Chinese people were here. We were just, it would be like, you know, white, colored, other, and like Chinese would fall under other. And I think part of the idea of that is to enable white supremacy, is like to keep these groups separate. Like, because if we were to band together, then like maybe we might actually dismantle white supremacy, instead of like using white supremacy to like sort of internalize these like stereotypes about, you know, the other group, like, oh yes, like Asians are very submissive, and like, you know, and like maybe like Asians have been taught to learn that like, oh, Black people are like, you know, scary or whatever, like, and they're taught that we're very submissive. And that's just like different tropes to, again, to sort of, I feel, to enable white supremacy. And actually, like, you know, this is all information I've sort of like also learned from minor feelings, and just like how, you know, the model minority myth was used to basically blame Black people for issues that were institutional and systemic, and it was not any fault of any individual Black person. It was actually racism, institutionalized racism, that sort of, you know, kept them from, you know, redlining and things like that, from having like the same success. So yeah, sorry, I went off on a tangent, but yeah, I think so much about like how, you know, white supremacy is enabled by pitting different historically excluded groups against each other.
I have a question. Is this, I just thought this up this morning, and I don't know if it's accurate, but I was thinking that Blacks were brought here early on in the history of the United States, and Asians are more immigrants rather than actually possessed, you know, owned by people. So I think that gives a different a disadvantage to Blacks from square one. And so I think maybe Asians were more able to shape their identity as immigrants than Blacks were, possibly. I don't know. And then the other thing I think is that Asians have big splits among themselves, which is a problem too, especially the Chinese and the Japanese, because of their history of the Japanese atrocities committed, or at least this is what I know about. There's others too, I'm sure, in all the different subcultures of the different, you know, I guess I usually think of the big three, Japan, Korea, and China, but there's other, probably Taiwanese versus the Aboriginal Taiwanese versus the mainlanders that came over, but there's all kinds of hierarchies even among the Asians. So we have to do a lot of overcoming to even get the Asians, AAPI people unified. And then I think it's really is important though to to figure out ways to link with all peoples of color. I think, and I think it's sort of like, you know, when the people from Mars come and attack us, then maybe Earthlings will get together. So a white's attacking us, I think we'll come together for a while, but then to keep that solid will be a little tricky, probably.
Yeah, I was thinking like what you were saying about white supremacy separating us all from each other. Like I was thinking a lot about how we just don't even see enough examples of like there isn't enough media coverage of when we all do come together. Like, I don't know, I think about like Yuri Kochiyama or Grace Lee Boggs. Like these are people that are like very integrated within the Black community. And there is this like unifying like desire to fight oppression. And I don't know, it makes me sad that we don't see those examples enough. And so it's easier to talk more about division than unity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think also thinking about like East Asian Americans as like white adjacent, like I think that's kind of a thing that people have said or thought, and like again with the model minority myth, like people definitely buy into that. We're like, yeah, we're hardworking, we deserve to, you know, have these advantages. But then at the same time, like Beth was saying, it's at the disadvantage of African Americans when we decided like step into those roles. But then at the same time, it's like, you know, then you remember all the different times where certain groups were highlighted or oppressed based on like the benefit to the government or like white supremacy, like, oh, okay, like World War II, like Chinese, you're okay now. Like we've been excluding you, we don't want you in our country, but now you're cool because now we're fighting the Japanese. And actually the Japanese are the bad ones, you know, like Chinese, you're okay. I don't know if people have seen those like propaganda posters from like that time period where it's like, this is what a Chinese person looks like. They look really good and like smart and they'll help you. And this is what a Japanese person looks like. They're evil, you know, but you know, just a few decades before that, it was like Chinese people are dirty, like watch out for them. You're like, it's not healthy. And then, you know, and then again, of course, like recently with COVID, it's like you sort of see like how, you know, it's kind of at the whim of whatever benefits whoever's in power. Like, okay, this group is now okay, this group is not okay. So just sort of thinking that in relation to like, I think there is this like false sense that, you know, East Asian Americans are white adjacent, when in actuality, it's like, you know, the past 2 years, I think have really, hopefully sort of dismantled that a little.
Great, thank you. So for the next question, let's see, this is sort of more about the ceramics, American ceramics in general, but the ceramics community in America borrows heavily from the history and techniques of Asian ceramics. Being both Asian and American, what are your thoughts on Asian influence versus appropriation by Westerners? And you could talk about things like, you know, maybe gatekeeping, what that means for the Asian community, you know, and who, you know, aesthetic of like who can use what language we can use, what techniques, or who's allowed to use what, that kind of stuff. And, you know, and just thinking about how we could continue to share knowledge while giving credit. Let's see, who should I pick? How about Nikki?
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings. Okay, I will say everything that I learned about ceramics predominantly came from like I was thinking about even just glazes and what's normalized. So I mean, I learned from like a male professor who's non-Asian, like very casually what orives, tenmukus, celadons, just all of these like very normalized glazes in most studios that I've been in, without any real historical context to it. And I think that's the part that's always missing for me, is the historical context and the like, I think we're so technique focused in our medium that sometimes we miss like other stories behind that. Like, where did it come from? The crediting of where we learn these things. I guess for me, like when it comes to influence versus appropriation, I've just seen a lot of white male potters that also like heavily, I'm going to say appropriate. It is appropriation because of that lack of credit, because of that lack of history and context. And then also the amount of profit that they get off of it. Because I could probably make the exact same thing that they are and have the historical context to it and still not make any kind of headway that they will in profit. I guess I think of it a lot like my friend had a really good analogy. It was like Portland food trucks. So like in Portland, there's a lot of like white people that take on like ethnic foods. So there's like, they're influenced by Nepali food. So they'll have a Nepali food truck, but the actual Nepalis who serve authentic Nepali food will not be able to sell as much food. Like they won't make the same business because they won't have the same level of accreditation the way that this white Nepali food truck does. And so I think that's where it's frustrating because it still plays into the power of white supremacy.
I think that in addition to the background that people need to have, they need to recognize that whenever they use a certain technique, that becomes part of their content of their work. So if they're using blue and white, then they need to recognize that is a choice, that it becomes, you know, I guess I just said part of the content, and that should come from the background. I think that the flip side of the question is how much do we share, and how much do we want the cultures to blend as opposed to stay separate? And I was thinking also about just sort of the ideal social world. Do we want everybody equal but separate? Or do we want everybody to just sort of mix up and turn into one generic blob? And then those questions of appropriation or sharing become more confusing. And you know, and I really do hate to see, like in Missoula, we have this thing called the Festival of the Dead, and it's totally taken from Mexico, and the people who started it was one guy who went to Mexico and fell in love with it, and so it just sort of became a Missoula weirdness. Our town has a lot of weird qualities, and people, I love that about it. Or I have another friend who's Brazilian, and she did this big mandala in the park, and it became a community event, annual event, where they dyed sawdust and made an enormous, you know, not football size, but, you know, really big mandala that was community. And then another friend who did the cool water hula. Have you heard of that, Cathy? They did a hula as a healing ceremony over the Butte Pit, but she's not Hawaiian. And so I hate to see those things not happen, because they're really wonderful sort of mixed culture things that occur. But it just seems like if you recognize the content somehow and bring that content to the foreground so it's clear, that would be my hope, that it's a credit, you know, credit due or something and maybe an effort to work to find people who are from that original culture. Okay, so then guilty me, I'm in a Brazilian band, I'm in a salsa band, I'm Chinese, what am I doing in those bands, you know? But I love both of those kinds of music, and it's, I don't know, I think it's really a big question, and it affects me in, you know, all the choices that I do in my work, because I'm constantly stealing from a culture that I'm not really completely, I don't have complete ownership of that culture, I think, because, you know, I wasn't really raised in China. I just have it, I can find it in the books, I can find it on Google just as easily as a white person can.
Yeah, Beth, I totally relate to that. And I do yoga, I practice yoga. No, totally, you know, I think it's such an interesting, you know, conversation. I think, you know, like both points that you and Nikki brought up are so important. And I kind of feel, yeah, I feel conflicted too. Like, I also think, you know, white people practicing maybe other cultural techniques or patterns, like somehow seem to get more credit. They seem to be like valued for, you know, refining or making it better, like whatever cultural print, you know. Whereas like the people of that culture, somehow they're just still considered primitive, or, you know, it's not contemporary, right? Like, so there is that for sure. But then also, it's like we kind of have to acknowledge that culture isn't like a thing that we own. It's always changing. Like, no culture is like inherently itself. You know what I mean? Like, you know, even thinking about blue and white pottery, like that cobalt didn't originate, it was imported in, you know? And then it, you know, added to the porcelain, and that became a thing, but it was inspired by another culture. And then, of course, like I think about like European versions of that and how they sort of, I don't know, I think it's arguable. I don't know, I have a lot of mixed feelings about it, you know, like Orientalism, fetishism, but then also like, did they make it their own? Like, did they sort of adapt it to their own cultures? And yeah, but I do think it's important to like kind of like, while acknowledging that like culture isn't a thing that's stagnant, it's always changing, it's always being influenced by other people. Like, there must also be a way to make sure that like there's more equity, like Nikki was saying, like, just because, you know, like we're not like, no one should try to be Picasso, where you're like, oh, you know, I just think about Picasso all the time, like, oh, he's a genius, like he's such a genius, he revolutionized art. But it's also like, he also made trips to Africa and like saw these beautiful African masks and like was inspired by that and used those influences in his work. But at the same time, like, people devalued those masks. They're like, oh, it's primitive, it's from, you know, now that Picasso's doing it, it's genius. Like, that's when you kind of want to punch a wall, like, you know? So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it is really interesting. I mean, I recently, I forget, like, I remember recently this past year, there was this white artist who used like these blue and white decals, like, you know, like very much like blue and white decals, like, you know, they were purchased in Jean Digent, like it was pretty obvious. And nowhere in her statement did it sort of talk about that lineage. And I remember people brought it up, and, you know, it became a thing on Instagram. Like, social media is such a mess. Like, it's not really for nuanced conversation or anything, but I remember some of the comments were like, well, you know, I was in China and the Chinese person told me it was cool, so like it must be cool. But, you know, and meanwhile, like, she's blocking all these Asian American artists that are saying like, oh, this may be problematic the way you're talking about this work. And so yeah, like, kind of like going back to what Beth was saying about how like, well, you know, we're Chinese, maybe Asian American, like, then just like somehow, like, I think in that person's comment, it was like, well, the Chinese person is more authentic, they're like more real, like they own, like they're closer to this than maybe like you who grew up in the US, you know. So there's all these like weirdnesses, and it's very complicated. But I think the real thing is just like, people are upset because there's no equity, you know, there's no, like, you know, I don't care if someone wants, I don't care if a white person wants to do blue and white, really. Like, if they want to do it, I mean, I think it's kind of lazy maybe, like, you know, it's kind of like putting gold luster on something, like it's gonna look good, like there's no, like blue and white, it's beautiful, like it's always gonna look good, there's just no question. So for me, it just feels like, oh, okay, like unless you have a real reason. it just sort of feels lazy. But what I actually do care about, I don't actually care if like white people, you know, use blue and white, but what I do care about is like how then maybe that white person starts to get credit for it or like starts to profit off of it. Whereas like maybe a person of color, like BIPOC person using those similar techniques, like just don't get the credit. Yeah. I don't know. It's infuriating actually, I think, but.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is a very complex, sort of involves multi-levels of perspectives and race, and yeah, it just, I totally agree that it's a very complicated question that no one really has the answer to, but I think we're in the direction of, I think crediting is towards the right direction. At least it starts with that. Okay, cool. The next question is talking more about your work. So how has your work considered these, you know, these kind of themes of like, you know, identity, politics, racism? Yeah, you know, what is the best way, what do you think is the best way to be an activist in your work? And have people ever told you that using Asian themes maybe is too easy as Asian artists? Okay, how about Beth?
Okay. As I've gotten older, I've wanted to be more socially active in my practice. And so I've considered, well, you know, I did earlier on too, but I always try to figure out, so the easiest way, and in my own comfort zone, the easiest thing for me to do is just do what I normally do and sell it and then donate money. But that's just sort of too easy. I would like to have the work itself be more mind changing. And I think that that's hard to do because within our context of contemporary art and galleries and museums, that work is going to certain audiences that are already predisposed towards a certain mindset. So I did a piece that was probably one of the more blatantly political pieces, which had, it was when Trump was first banning immigrants, and it had this Chinese guy waving an American flag and saying, "Do not enter," and then these little figures of different skin tones. And it was meant to be ironic, but as I looked at that piece, I thought if this was not in a gallery, this could be read literally, "Do not enter, all you people of color." It could have been read as pro-Trumpian politics. So I think that our context is a lot of how you make work politically, make a political statement through the work itself. So that was tricky. And then how do you make work that actually creates movement or action? I did a piece once where I had a tablet of paper that you could tear the sheet off and take home the telephone numbers of your local politicians to call. And that I felt was something that was helpful. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, I'm sort of back to making fundraisers, to doing fundraisers, and I'm trying to initiate fundraisers that I did one for COVID and I did one for voting rights. So yeah, I think that's all something that I would like to do I'd like to have in my life things that are more socially helpful without having to go to the soup kitchen, because that's not my comfort level. So figuring out my pace and my talents, how to make those kind of things go together. Just really quickly, as for is using Asian American themes too easy? That was the question that Jennifer Dachuk Lin asked me. And so it's made me think about that a little bit. And sometimes I think it's that guilt thing again. Am I just also just appropriating from a culture that I'm not as really deeply embedded in? And I think it's kind of what you do with it, and hopefully I'm doing something. And then the third thing that, I don't know, is this the next question? Well, maybe I'll let somebody else talk for a while, and then, because we have one question, it might fit more for that. So.
Oh yeah, Nikki, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know if you could tell from my images, but my work like drastically changed this year. So, yeah, I would say for like 13 years, my work was entirely sculptural and about identity politics. And yeah, this year I decided to try something different. Yeah, I kind of like, I don't know what happened, but when the pandemic hit, I'm like, I'm gonna do pottery. Like I just woke up and decided I need to do this. And it made sense for me because it was like the integration of my love for food. And like, I think food in a universal way can be captured through all cultures. And frankly, it's what we need to do every day. So it made sense to try to highlight that. So yeah, I guess my activism looks different. I would call it pleasure activism. It's about seeking joy. And for me, like the pottery that I'm creating right now is very much about just nurturing my inner child. Like that's what I needed when the pandemic hit. I just felt really tired and scared. And I felt like I spent 13 years yelling into a void about how I felt about being Asian American. And I just wanted to try something different. So, and then, yeah, like Beth, I also donate, I sign petitions. Yeah, and I used to be a part of AmeriCorps. So I spent every Saturday for a year volunteering somewhere. So, yeah, and doing a lot of like emotional labor and like really trying to figure out what identity meant. Yeah, and I guess for me right now, it's like to that sub question about, is it easy? I think I did it before because I could, because I wanted to know something for myself, because I had so many burning questions about what it meant to be Asian American. And I could use sculpture to start to define and figure out those answers or questions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think,
Oh, I was just gonna say, that's where it started for me too, with a personal question about my identity. But yeah, okay, go ahead, Cathy.
yeah, no, same for me as well. Yeah, I would say, I guess, well, okay, I don't think of my work as activism in any way. Like, I don't think anyone would look at my work and say like, oh, I need to call my governor to talk about this, or like, now I need to go to a protest. Like, it's just not direct like that. And I think it's okay. I mean, I think it is about identity and race, but it's kind of more, I mean, kind of like, I think both of your works too, Beth, like your work with the text, like I just, you know, again, fan for a long time. Nikki, I'm a new fan of yours. Like, I think there is a lot there without being so like, okay, like call this number and ask for this or whatever. And I think that's okay, because I think it does open up spaces that are also important for joy or healing or whatever, humor. But yeah, I did the same, like Beth, like I was like, okay, you know, I have no money, I'm broke, but I do have a lot of stuff in my studio. So I like also did raffles and donated all that money to like Black Visions and BLM and whatever. I do have friends who are, I think, more art activisms, like where it's more directly addressing racism and social justice. And so I basically just help them with their work or contribute to their work. Right now I have a friend, Christy Chan, who is doing this project called Dear America, where she's like guerrilla projecting like giant projections, like 5-6 stories tall, all with like all with like messages of support for BLM, for AAPI communities, as a response to the like increase in AAPI hate over the last few years. and I guess historically as well. But yeah, and in terms of the like Asian American themes, I just feel like that's such a racist question. Like, I don't know, like I feel like it's the sort of same like, oh, is it too easy? Like, is it easy for you to talk about Asian identity because you're Asian? I just kind of feel like it's a similar, like it's kind of like framed through, I think, a white perspective. Like, oh, it's so easy for you because you're Asian. Now you get to talk about Asian things. It's like, it's not like that, you know? It's sort of like the same idea of like, oh, you're here. Like Mindy Kaling talks about it a lot. Like, oh, she was a diversity hire, you know, at the office. And like people sort of treated her as such at first, you know? And of course she's super talented and, you know, is doing amazing things. But I think that's sort of a similar thing. Like, oh, like it's so easy for you because you're Asian to, like, it's too easy. I don't think it's easy. I don't know if the rest of you agree. It's not easy. I would love to just make like stuff about whatever, like, I don't know, I don't know, like I would love to make stuff about other stuff, but I just can't.
I mean, I'm doing it right now. I'm like, wow.
Oh. You're like, it's great.
Sorry, just quickly, we're about done with time. Actually, no, that's great. I loved your response, Cathy. We're about done with time. I think, I don't know if we have enough time for a Q&A. Regina, your thoughts at the end?
Also, can I just say one quick thing? I think that what I feel like I'm doing work about Asian American or putting Chinese in my work or putting all Chinese kids is what my goal is to make people comfortable with foreignness. And I think that is a political statement too, to be comfortable with difference. So.
Yeah, it's like inherently political, totally.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. Okay, sorry, Jessica, back to you.
Jessica, yeah, we have time, plenty of time for questions. If anybody wants to type a question into the chat menu, we can call it out or have Jessica read it out. But we do invite you. Let me see, there is a Q&A here. Jenny Chen says, very thought-provoking discussion. How do we become more expressive so they can hear what our issues are, including other Asian Americans? So I think the question there is, how do we become more expressive so they can hear what our issues are? And this is addressed also to other Asian Americans. Would anybody like to take that up? Maybe Cathy, would you like to address that?
Oh, sorry, I'm still reading the question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How do we become more expressive so that they can hear what our issues are? Like how to become more outspoken, or? Sorry, I guess maybe I don't understand the question. I don't know if I understand it.
I think
I don't know if
follows on. It says we need to become more articulate. The issues have.
Oh,
yeah.
I guess just like my first reaction is just sort of thinking about like having grown up in the United States, you're sort of I don't know. It's always curious to me to think about like people like, you know, Asians who grow up in Asia and then like Asian Americans who grow up in America. And it's definitely like a different vibe, I feel. Like you sort of like absorb all this racism in the beginning, like when you're young and you don't know what's happening. And so then you have all this like, again, internalized self-doubt, like you sort of feel like you don't belong. And I feel like that really messes with your confidence levels or like knowing what you deserve or what is your right to have. So yeah, I think like for me, it's been like a lot of unpacking that and like, yeah, I guess being more articulate, more outspoken. Whereas I feel like before I would have really just, you know, if someone like, if there was like, you know, again, microaggressions or whatever, like I think like previously I sort of just let it slide or ignored it. I try to like forget about it. And now it's much more like, now I'm much more like, you know, I noticed, like I always noticed it, but I felt bad about it or felt weird, but I never really tried to like understand it, I guess, or it was never really spoken about. But now that like I feel way more people are talking about it, I just feel it's so much healthier. And now I can really like pinpoint those things and like, you know, sort of point them out to people as well. So that they, you know, because I don't think it's intentional always. actually, I think most of the time it's very unintentional when people are racist. They just don't know, you know? So I think it's important now to like actually point those things out. Whereas before I would never, like in personal relationships even, like, whereas before I think I would have always just let it kind of like, oh, well, I know them, like it's not a big deal, you know? I don't know.
Thank you so much there, Cathy. Would anybody else like to respond to that?
I think venues for expressing it. Maybe that's what Jenny's asking. What are the venues for being expressive or airing your complaints? And in the larger political scheme and social scheme, I'm not sure, you know, like groups, joining groups or finding like minds or voting, you know, getting involved or being expressive in whatever your particular forte is, being open to conversation. That is a tough one. I know I run away from conflict, you know. It's hard to engage people that disagree with you or are critical of you. So courage, like Cathy says. So I don't know. I think everybody has to find their niche. I'm not very good on social media, but I would imagine that there are some social media outlets too for that.
I also hate conflict, and I think that I make art because I'm passive aggressive. But
Right
like,
now.
oh, I don't want to talk about this, but my art does. So let's talk about it.
The secret is out. You just unveiled all our secrets.
That's good.
I would just like to ask the panel, and this is coming, you know, from partly my own interests, but do you think women are taking a more active role in addressing issues, social issues these days, including identity issues, than men, or do you think it's an equal playing field?
I feel like I'm talking to more women, but so I don't know what the big picture is, but I feel like for me, my conversations are more with women, and there's certainly more women being prominent in political arenas. What do you guys think? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think the same, Beth. I think most of the people, like I've, you know, have joined a few like sort of affinity groups this year, and it's mostly women. And I don't know if that's just because I'm also a woman and most, you know, that's just how that worked. But I do feel women do a lot of labor, like in general, like just in life, like we just do a lot of labor. So maybe, I'm not sure though.
I mean, I think the two groups that I'm in, like ceramics and if I am in an activist group, like they're both dominated by women. So inevitably that's happen.
That may be because we like to talk more, or we communicate a little better. I'm not too sure, but I do find that a lot of conversations, really deep and meaningful conversations that in my own experience, a lot of it is coming from female friends and female colleagues, but that's not to say that the men aren't active too. I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Jessica, would you like to, is there any more questions you'd like to ask before we wrap up?
If the audience doesn't have any more questions, let me see. Okay, how about, I have a few questions from the list still, but if there's any particular question from the list that any of the panelists want to have a burning answer, or it's you could talk now. But I would say I'm interested in, like, what would you say? Would you say there's like an Asian American aesthetic in ceramics? Like, what does that mean? I know a lot of it is like sourcing from, like, say China, or like, you know, mining those, like the cultural techniques and, you know, and imagery from that. But like, I'm just wondering, what, because we're not just Asian, we're like Asian American, and what that means. What do you think that means? And do you see it in your work? Like, what do you call your work? Asian American ceramics. Okay, all right, how about Cathy, do you have any thoughts?
You know, I don't know. I was just talking about this with someone yesterday. Like, I have such a hard, like all of these identifying, I guess, labels, I have such a hard time with, like, because yes, like I love the idea of Asian American because it sort of grew out of a political movement, like out of the civil rights movement, you know, so I love that term and that idea of like coming together. But also recognizing that like I'm just, you know, one small part of, like, Asian is such a big thing, such a diverse thing, you know, and then like Chinese also, but like actually my parents grew up in Taiwan, but you know, so there's just like all these like, oh, do I call myself Taiwanese American, but I was born in the States, like, you know, but I studied Chinese in college, so it's like weird or I don't know, all these phrases are weird. So I don't know if I have a specific like idea of what Asian American looks like. I just feel like it's such a, yeah, I don't know that I know what it, like, I don't know what we are, or who we are. Like, and I think it's exciting that we're sort of like establishing that. I really feel like just in my like lifetime, I feel like it's changed so much. So to say like, is there an Asian American aesthetic? Like, I don't know. Because not all Asian Americans, I think the three of us, or maybe Nikki not as much now, like sort of have engaged with like really specific like symbols like from China or traditional symbols. But I don't know if that is necessary for something to be considered Asian American, or if I don't know like why that label would be important. I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear what other people think too.
One thought that I had, which I don't know if this is correct or not, but since I've been to China a few times since starting in about 1995, I saw in China the change of their contemporary art scene from kind of a off the wall weird aesthetic to very self-parodying, you know, taking the Quaker Oats box and putting Mao's face on it. A lot of stuff about Mao, and a lot of sort of just kind of what we're doing too, you know, taking something old and reinventing it, and contrasting Western and Eastern imagery. So that seemed to happen very much in China's contemporary art scene. And when I think about it, I can't think of any Japanese American artists that are doing something similar, or maybe Korean a little bit with Steve Lee and his moon jars. But I was just wondering if it's partly that Asian American trope is coming from the fact that the contemporary Chinese were doing that too. Just I don't know if that's true or not, but I did recognize that they definitely went that direction with their art, and it became very popular in the US galleries and stuff. But beyond that, and one other thought I have is that I feel like an understanding of the immigrant experience is part of what certain cultures, and for sure Asian American culture, is about, and that probably informs our aesthetic to a certain extent.
Yeah, I also have a hard time with like boxing too. I think that's why when I like look at my art that I have made about this topic, it feels more like I'm documenting my confusion and love for being Asian American. Like I think a lot about something that David Chang said. I reference food a lot if you haven't noticed. But yeah, I like something that he said. He was like, when he opened Momofuku, like people were saying, oh yeah, this is an Asian restaurant. But he was like, no, this is an American restaurant. And maybe I think what we're not saying is that we're not defining, or the way that we define American in the subtext is the baseline of it being white. So what if American was all of us?
Mm.
then it would be more normalized, and then we wouldn't even have this conversation.
Yes. I love that.
A good summation.
Okay, I think we're good. Anyone else have any other questions? Anything from the audience, or we're all good? Okay, I think we could wrap up. Okay, thank you three so much. I felt like this was such an honest conversation. It like touched home with me in so many ways, and hopefully, I hope the audience took something away from this too. If not, that's okay. You know, it was just lovely having a conversation with you three, and I think yeah, we're, you know, just like thinking about identity, and like I think it's good that we're trying not to like box it or label it. So it's that kind of fluid conversation, and I think it makes sense that you know, even the label Asian is kind of, you know, like, what is that, right? And especially in America, where everything is vague on purpose, like Black, white, Asian, like, what is that? But anyhow, thank you all again so much for continuing this conversation, which will keep on continuing, I hope, in the future, as we think about these kind of themes, and continue post-pandemic in this kind of America. Yeah, it's great, and I hope to see you three making more work and doing good things, and decompressing. And I hope the same for the audience too. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks to our panel, and thank you for attending tonight with Clay Arts Centre. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.